Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL, end of round 2, all of round 3, overview and analysis video here in the summer playoffs. Sorry for condensing all of this into one video, but all of these games happened over the course of one weekend, and that means a lot to cover in this one individual episode. In this one, we're going to be finishing out, all of the games from round 2, so the lower bracket of round 2 all the way through the semifinals. We're gonna know our final 2 teams in the NACL by the end of this episode, which I know means quite a bit to cover. That's 5 series, 3 of those being best of 5s, and so going to get into it relatively quickly here. But if you guys are excited for the content and enjoying everything, let me know down in the comments section below what teams really impressed you this weekend and what teams maybe fell a little bit short of your expectations. There's some pretty obvious answers to both of those questions in my opinion, but also let me know some individual player performances that really stood out to you. Of course, I'll go over a lot of mine over the course of this video, but would love to know you guys' thoughts on a lot of these players, a lot of these teams. As the developmental league here in North America, it's always good to get an idea of which players might be performing well in big situations like a playoff series, and not just which teams are doing well at the current moment. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate in each series. Of course, you know, some of these will be best of 3s, some of these will be best of 5s. Gonna be going over them relatively similarly. I'm gonna go very in-depth on the finals, do not worry, but just for the sake of brevity, I'm gonna still do the same format where I was covering the series as a whole at once. Of course, that means we will also be going over my player of the series and my dud of the series for each individual series. And like I said at the beginning, by the end of this episode, we are going to know the final 2 teams, the 2 finalists in the NACL in the summer split. So exciting stuff ahead, and without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. We're going to go in the same order that all of the series happened. I know that means we're going to jump around a little bit from, lower to upper bracket and, so on and so forth, but I think it's probably the easiest way to keep track of things, and that means we get to kick off with the ending here of round number 2, the lower bracket in round number 2, the teams that ended up not being able to make it either out of the round number 2 in the upper bracket, or the teams that just did win in the lower bracket in round number 1. So certainly going to be intriguing either way, and we kick it off with a matchup between the number 2 seeded FlyQuest Challengers and the number 5 seeded Wildcard Gaming. And FlyQuest is going to be able to get the job done. They're going to be able to take this series 2-1, which is really big. Obviously, Wildcard, not a pushover of a team, but FlyQuest is actually an incredibly good team. Still one that I think has to be considered one of the favorites here in the NACL, if only just because of the talent level of this team and obviously the commitment of this organization to build something here in Tier 2. But Wildcard certainly weren't pushovers, and honestly, they had a really, really tough schedule here in the NACL playoffs. Obviously, they got to play Maryville, which was probably the easiest matchup they could have, but having to face Fear in round number 1 and then having to face FlyQuest, that is a very tough draw in terms of being able to get near the top echelon, but I guess that's what you get for not being one of the top 4 teams in the playoffs. It's just unfortunate how that ends up going, but FlyQuest looked really good in this series. Game 2 was an absolute blast to watch. That was Wildcard's 1 win of the series, and that was probably the most fun game. I mean, almost 60 kills in 32 minutes, just an absolute bloodbath coming in from both of those teams. But FlyQuest really controlled the series basically outside of that. Games 1 and 3 were really all Fly, and it was very impressive. It was honestly a very traditional performance coming in from them, considering what we had seen from them in the regular season. It was a lot more that than it was kind of what we saw against DSG, which was just them not being as good in the big moments, which was certainly unfortunate. My player of the series is going to go to Yuji in the jungle. I don't feel like enough people are bringing up just how good Yuji has been over the course of this split. FlyQuest has certainly not always lived up to expectations, and DSG being able to take them down in round number 2 was obviously kind of a blow to their mental, but Yuji has certainly not been a problem for them. In fact, I would argue that this is easily his best split in the NACL from an individual perspective. That Graves game in game number 3 was a hard carry game. He hard carried them into round number 3, which certainly cannot be understated how important that is for a player like Yuji and, just for his development. I think he has shown that he can really be someone that you can plug resources into, and he can win you games, at least at this level. And obviously, FlyQuest is not struggling for talent at at the LCS level, but who knows what direction that org is going to be going in this offseason, what with how disappointing everything was in the LCS. And Yuji's a player that I think could more than survive at the LCS level at this point with what he has shown over the course of this year. The Poppy was obviously really good, but he is going to be mostly getting this for that Graves game in game number 3, where he ended up just dominating. He was really good as a facilitator the rest of the series, but he put his carry pants on for that one and really dragged them across the finish line. The carry duo of FlyQuest was also really good. Spirax and Masu, I think, were really big positives towards the team overall, and Faisal, I think, had one of his best series on FlyQuest. About damn time. Like, I really like Faisal, and I think he's shown a ridiculous amount at the NACL level, especially on Fear last split, where it felt like he was constantly winning lane, constantly dominating team fights, was legitimately one of the best top laners. It felt like he wasn't quite as dominant here on Fly. Obviously, we've talked about him not getting nearly as many resources, mostly being this kind of like weak side tank player for Fly over the course of this split, but it felt like he really got an opportunity to kind of, flex his muscles in this one against Zamudo, a pretty aggressive top laner, and he was definitely better. He was certainly up in that matchup, and so really good to see that. Like I said, Spirax and Masu, really good this series. Not that that's surprising at all. Spirax has really gotten back into form and is playing his best league of 2023 right now. And Masu is Masu. Like, really, what do you want me to say? The dude is ridiculous. He's probably going to win MVP. And then Winsome was really good as well. I think Winsome, honestly, I've talked about this before, gets a little bit underappreciated because he gets to play with Masu, but this is the best bot lane in Fly, or in the NACL for a reason. And it's because both of these guys are probably the best in their roles. They're really just very, very good. And so when Fly's clicking, they're going to be very difficult to stop, but this is the end of the road for Wildcard, and honestly, you do got to tip your cap to them a little bit. I do think that they were pretty good this split, and honestly, like, certainly not a disappointment in any stretch. I think that they were very competitive. A couple of players that really stepped up, obviously, most notably Keel in the jungle. He was revealed as the 3rd place in the MVP voting. We know 3rd and 2nd place. We don't quite know 1st place yet. I think Masu is definitely someone that a lot of people are looking at in terms of being able to get that award. Yuji, I wouldn't be surprised to see in that spot either, depending on if they want to go 3 junglers, but Keel was in that for a reason, and it's because I think he really exploded as somebody who could play a variety of different styles this split. He was really good as a facilitator. He was really good as a carry. Could really do whatever you needed him to do. Obviously, he's going to be known for like the Nunu and the Karthus and things that you're pretty traditionally going to associate with him, but he was awesome on the Viego in game number 2. Almost single-handedly won them that game towards the back half. Also worth noting that Wildcard was kind of known for their unique and creative drafts over the course of this year, and then unfortunately in this series they go basically the same draft every single game. The only adjustment that they made was Jinx in game 3. I wish they would have went Aphelios just to get the 3 exact same drafts in all 3 games, because that would have been incredible, but they switched it up there. They changed 1 pick across the entire series, which is just an insane thing to say, but clearly they felt confident in being able to capitalize on this draft. It just wasn't going to be enough, but dud of the series for me is going to go to Zamudo in the top lane. Just felt like he was getting outclassed on the gangplank. A couple of really, really bad games at the beginning of this series. He was a little bit more competent, I would say, in game number 3, but by that point, I think it was a little bit too late. Game 1 was a disaster for the GP, and game 2, he almost, I don't want to say solo lost, but certainly was not doing Wildcard any favors in the early game by being as exploitable into that Olaf as he was. And so just a couple of things that I think definitely concerned me, but we knew Zamudo was a feast or famine player. I'm not even necessarily going to be mad at him. He's had so many good moments for this team over the course of this split, but obviously with that comes a couple bad moments, and I don't think he was particularly good in this series. I think the bot lane was also pretty outclassed. That was also probably the most noticeable kind of difference between Wildcard and Fly, is that Lens and Donbray just weren't as good as Masu and Winsome, but how can you expect them to be, right? It's Masu and Winsome. They're really good. Saligo was, I guess, fine, but wasn't necessarily a game breaker. Keel really was the one that I think stood out in a positive way, but that's kind of been the case for Wildcard over the course of this entire split, in my opinion. But this team certainly doesn't have a lot to hang their head on. Like, this was a good split for them overall. I think a lot of these players ended up raising their stocks rather than lowering them, especially the jungle mid, in my opinion, of Keel and Saligo, who I think both were really good, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. You never really know where players go in the offseason in Tier 2, but a lot of these players I would expect to see again in either the NACL or maybe in the LCS in Keel's case. And then FlyQuest on the other side, their journey is not over. They're going to be moving on. We'll cover their future series in this video, but this was a good one overall. They're just so talented. Wildcard's not a bad team, and FlyQuest really was able to take care of them. This is just step 1, though. Being able to get, like, top 4, that's probably a disappointment for Fly. They want to get to finals, and they've got a good chance of being able to get there. And then moving on to our other round 2 lower bracket series, and this one I've really been interested in talking about. We had the number 1 seeded Team Liquid Challengers taking on the number 7 seeded Evil Geniuses Challengers. And EGC picks up a massive victory here. Not only is it a victory, not only did they just eliminate the #1 seed in the entire tournament as the 7 seed, you know, them going out in like, what, 5th, 6th place, but, you know, Evil Geniuses played really well in this series, and they won 2-0. They didn't drop a single game in this series. It's an unreal performance coming in from Evil Geniuses, and you've just got to be excited for this team. We've always talked about the talent that they've had. I've always ranked them high in my power rankings. I had them #1 in my preseason power rankings when we thought this team was going to look a little bit different. Obviously, you know, Ryoma, King, and Smoothie in, but, you know, the original top side of Soul and Shaden, I thought that they were going to be the #1 team back in January of this year. Obviously, that did not work out. They were not very good in spring. They were a bottom 4 team in spring, if you don't remember, but they get their spot back. Evil Geniuses decides to stay in the NACL as one of the 3 only LCS orgs to do so, and they don't make any changes to their roster. But as the split goes on, first of all, they get King back, which is massive. They get Ryoma for a full split, which is massive. Both of those players have been crucial to what Evil Geniuses has been doing, but Soul ends up taking some time away, and so Surdy comes in. You know, I like Soul, but I think Surdy is a really good player, and I think that's been a bit of an upgrade. And then Shaden goes to the main roster because of what I would assume is just some communication and teamwork things. But Armeo has been awesome for this Evil Geniuses Challengers team, and everything is now clicking to where, like, I don't know, can they be the #1 team in the NACL? Maybe. Like, this has been really good for them. Ryoma is going to get my player of the series for this particular series, but I think this really could go to almost anybody. Everybody on EG played really well. Ryoma was just the one that I think was capitalizing on a lot of the things that were set up by Evil Geniuses over the course of this. 2 games of Tristana, you can't give it to him anymore. Like, I know that Ryoma's not exactly like a priority target, but he really should be in terms of drafts. At the very least, you have to be able to take away Trist, because he's been able to play it so consistently, not only obviously in this series, but over the course of this entire year. I'm honestly surprised that Team Liquid didn't want to make that adjustment going into game #2. Maybe they felt like they wanted to trade the 2 big mid laners of this patch in Tristana and Jace, but it just did not work in their favor, in my opinion. And Ryoma was definitely the better mid laner in this series, which caused some major problems for Team Liquid, because they really had no easy way of being able to shut down the Trist in the mid game, and that was really a problem. But everybody played well. King and Smoothie were awesome. I love that King is more than willing to play these AP bot laners. We've seen just how good those picks can be by a lot of different teams over the course of the NACL. The Seraphine in particular is nice to bring out, but Kais is just incredibly strong, even going into something like Ziggs. In that game 1, Smoothie's been really, really good, which is cool. It's good to see him play well when the rest of the team is playing well, because his individual performances were certainly questionable at the beginning of the year. And Armeo and Surdy have inserted themselves in this team and honestly been upgrades to everything else that Evil Geniuses was doing. I love Surdy. I think he's so good at League of Legends. Like, is he like a top 2, 3 top laner in the NACL? Maybe. Like, I would probably put him in that category. It was probably Fake God, Bradley, and then Surdy. But Surdy was just straight up better than Bradley in this series. We'll get to Bradley in a second. I don't think he individually played bad, but I wanted to give a lot of credit to what Surdy was able to do, because he really has been that dude ever since coming on to Evil Geniuses. And he was really good for Team Liquid first last split as well. And that team was really struggling. And so just in general, I'm really buying in on what Surdy is able to offer at this level. And I really do think he could be someone that, you know, plays for a top-tier team and is ranked as a top-tier top laner. And obviously, Armeo was too good for this level. We've known that for a long time, and he continues to be a massive positive, whether it's on more facilitators like Ivern or something like a Nocturne that's going to be diving with the Tristana. It doesn't matter. Evil Geniuses feel very complete right now, and this series, I think, encapsulated that. But for Team Liquid, like, this is disaster. Really, you can't say anything else. You were the #1 team pretty unanimously coming into the playoffs, and you're going to be leaving as one of the first big teams to end up leaving. The first LCS-affiliated team to end up bowing out of the playoffs, and that's just really not good. I don't want to say not acceptable, but it's got to be frustrating for this team and for these players, but I do think that there are some things to take away. I don't think individually they played awful this series. Like, Harry individually had some moments, Mir and Arrow individually had some moments. You know, I don't think Bradley and Kim Down were all that good over the course of this series, but I don't think they were necessarily massive problems either. It just felt like Team Liquid got outplayed, and that's going to happen every once in a while, but the expectations on this team and on this org were sky high, and to go out in 5th, 6th is certainly disappointing. Bradley's going to get my dud of the series. Again, if only because I just think I want to praise Surdy a bit for what his performance was on the Cassante and the Jax. Bradley really had no impact on this series. The Kennen meant literally nothing in game number 1, and the Gragas was worse in game number 2. And I think in general, it's just really crazy to see Bradley kind of get outplayed in the laning phase, but everybody kind of was outplayed. Like, Harry was more outplayed than you would expect given his 3-2-3 scoreline, had no pressure on the map, really allowed the Tristana to do whatever she wanted and kind of didn't really get to play the game. Mir was certainly worse than Armeo in terms of pressure, especially when you compare the two Nocturne games. Arrow and Kim Down weren't really doing anything. A lot of those rel engages in particular were just at really inopportune times, and Kim Down was playing way too aggressive, you know, for the state of the game that they were in, and just in general, Team Liquid felt like they didn't really have full control of this. But again, it's just got to be, as frustrating as it is for us as viewers, it's got to be 8,000 times more frustrating for these players and for this staff. I'm certainly not going to blame them too much. It very much feels like the second place curse all over again. But for TL, a lot of these players showed a lot of improvement and a lot of good things over the course of this split. I certainly don't think you should take it out on them. They had a bad performance in playoffs, but I still trust this org, and I still trust a lot of these players. It's going to be interesting. Players like Mir are certainly going to get looked at for like LCS spots next year because of how they've played over the course of this year. I don't know how much people are going to take into the playoffs, but it's certainly not great to see this team bow out a little bit earlier than expected. But for Evil Geniuses on the other side, really, really massive win. You now move on to take on FlyQuest, the team that just won in the other side of this bracket, and that's going to be a super intriguing series that I'm excited to cover later in this video. But for now, for you to be in the top 4 teams in the NACL, you know, with the way you've performed a lot over the course of this year, I would consider that already a positive for Evil Geniuses. But now we have officially left the best of 3 stage here in the playoffs, and we are entering the best of 5 stage. We're going to be taking a detour from the lower bracket and moving back up to winner's bracket, and it's the final 2 teams in upper bracket. One of these teams is going to be heading to the finals of the NACL. The other will have to play in the semifinals for an attempt to get their revenge, but this is a really, really intriguing series. 2 teams that I'm very excited to see in this spot. We had Disguised taking on Cincinnati Fear, and DSG is going to be able to pick up the win not only in a 3-2 5-game set, but in a reverse sweep. Utterly devastating for Fear, but massive series from DSG. First and foremost, if you want to see some live reactions to everything that happened in this series, I actually live streamed all 5 of these games. The link to that obviously is down in the description below. You can go ahead and check that out. I'm going to try to live stream the finals. I'm not going to guarantee that I'm going to be able to do that, but I certainly would like to. And so if you want to see some live commentary and reactions, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitch. Of course, you can check out the VOD if you want some like in-depth live reactions to some of the plays in these games. But talking about it here, it's super sad for Fear. It felt like they had full control of this series at the beginning, but DSG, you gotta give them a ton of credit. Not only did they never really give up in this series, they didn't give up in any of the individual games as well. Game number 1 was 50 minutes, and it really felt like it, right? Like, it was a back-and-forth game that really came down to basically one final fight in the end that Fear was able to win. And the rest of the games, while they weren't as, you know, nerve-wracking, Game 3 certainly had its moments. I do think that both teams really showed up here, and both showed why they were in the upper bracket finals to begin with in the first place. This was not a battle between 2 teams that were not worthy of being, you know, the last 2 teams and winners. This was the 2 best teams at that time in the tournament, and I think that that is a really, really fun thing to be able to say. But congratulations to DSG. Obviously, there are a lot of people out there that are cheering for this org, and I totally get it. Obviously, being a fan of a big influencer and having their team, a big content creator, having, you know, them be able to purchase a team in a league that you support, it's a massively big positive. And then for that team to go on and be one of the best in the entire league with a crazy amount of talent from former champions to up-and-coming young stars, it's the best case scenario, I think, for the NACL and for North America as a whole. This team has really gelled. All of the young players, all of the veterans, everything is working for them. They have some of the best players in every single role, and it really is coming together, and that makes player of the series kind of hard. Now, I want to preface this, and I guess the final 3 series that we talk about in this video, with the fact that giving player and dud of the series for a best of 5 is, like, impossible, and it really shouldn't happen this way. You know, I typically give player of the game and dud of the game in best of fives because we go game by game in a lot of the other regions, but because of the way I structured this video, it's all kind of together into one little package here. But I really don't think that there is one definitive best player in a series, one definitive worst player in a series. I think boiling it down like that typically isn't quite as fair, and so I'm going to be a little bit more lenient. I would say take these, player of the series and dud of the series with more of a grain of salt. Everybody played well. This went to 5 games for a reason. None of these 10 players had 5 bad games. I can guarantee you that. All of them played really well. And I think that it's just kind of, it's just kind of a fault of the system, if you will, a flaw in the planning. But if I did have to give a player of the series, it is going to go to Meech in the bot lane for me. Just felt like he was so consistent at the end of all of these games. Had a couple of moments at the beginning of the series where it looked like he was going to be able to keep some games alive for DSG. That Sivir in game 1, obviously that champion takes so long to get online, but if you do get to that point with Sivir, she's very difficult to deal with, and her wave clear was actually making ending the game very difficult for Fear in game number 1, but the back half of his series was so ridiculously good. The Aphelios, the Xayah, the Jinx, it didn't really matter. All 3 games were mega successes for Meech. And you've just got to be super excited about that. Again, a player who can be a little bit hit or miss in certain moments has really stepped it up when these games have mattered the most in the playoffs. I think a player that's going to go really underrated for just how consistent he was over the course of this series was Tomio as well. God damn, Tomio was good. I actually very narrowly gave him player of the series here. 4 said 20 games, and then a Maokai game that was utterly devastating. That Maokai game, I think, completely got DSG back into the mental state where they felt like they could win this game. Fear actually felt like they had full control of that 3rd game in the early game because they were winning, and they had Kai'Sa Kog'Maw, and if you're going to be winning in the early game with a comp like that, it's going to be very difficult to come back, but Tomio was a big reason why they were able to get back in that game, in my opinion. It was really fun to see him be able to operate, and I think he's really solidified himself as one of the best junglers in the NACL. He was last split on Cloud9. He has continued to be that for DSG this split, but 4 games of Sedge to take it away from Perry. Obviously, it was a major positive for them. I think Zeyzal was spectacular. The Rakan in particular, I think, really shined over the back half of the series, and the Braum in Game 3 really was very big. I love Braum as a champion in the meta right now. I think he does so much against a lot of the really meta champions, and I think he was really good in Game 3, but Young, Fake God, they were good as well. I think Fake God certainly had a lot of fantastic moments in team fights. He wasn't quite as dominant in lane. I'll talk about Philip in a bit. I was super impressed with what Philip was doing for Fear. I think you could argue he might have been the best player on Fear in this series, but Fake God definitely was stepping up in team fights. And while Young was a little bit more of like a secondary carry for this team, I think that's a role that he's really mastered. That was something that he did pretty well on Golden Guardians last split, and I think he continues to do so here, and especially on a team where you're kind of surrounded by superstar talent. You're not going to complain about that at all, but DSG is now moving on to grand finals, and unfortunately for Fear, they're going to be moving down into losers finals. They probably wanted to be able to win this series after going up 2-0. I can't imagine how demoralizing a loss like this is, but they showed so many good things in this series that I think hanging on some of the negatives just isn't positive or beneficial for them, because ignoring the good stuff that you did in this series, I think is just almost impossible. There was too much good. I think Philip in particular was actually fantastic. This is his best series, in my opinion, as a member of Cincinnati. Fear, obviously, the Renekton games in games 1, 2, and 3 were all really positive. That's a champion that we've all known that Philip is very good at. It's kind of been his calling card, at least in the playoffs here, but I think even the Jax and the Cassante had very good moments. I think in general, I was very impressed by what Philip was able to do into another great top laner in Fake God, like legit the best top laner at this level. Philip more than held his own, I guess you could say. I think, obviously, Shochi, I think, had a pretty solid series. I wanted to see a little bit more out of him on the Kai'Sa in the middle games, but I think that's more so a champion problem. When you're playing Kai'Sa into LeBlanc, you're going to lose pressure in the mid lane. Like, it's just going to happen. The LeBlanc is going to be able to move around more. And I don't think Shochi got to play his style nearly as much as he wanted to, but I think he was really good when he did get the opportunity on things like the Akshan and the Tristana and the Ziggs in Game 2. Was really good. Manui looked awesome on some of his more comfort picks like the Ziggs and the Sarah at the beginning of the series, and yeah, there were some moments towards the back half where it was a little bit less consistent, but honestly, I don't blame any of these losses on Manui. I think, generally speaking, the Kog, the Zeri, the Kai'Sa, they were fine. They were generally good enough And even though I'm giving dud of the series to JJ, I don't even necessarily think he had a bad series at all. I think the Nautilus in Game 2 was really good in particular, like the Rakan in Game 1, and I get the Alistair pick in Game 5. I am a little bit confused by the Leona pick in Game 4. I talked about this live. I really just don't like Zeri Leona. I don't think it necessarily gives you the things that you want, and I generally think that Leona is a little bit over-prioritized in the meta right now, as opposed to things like Alistair, and as opposed to Rakan, or any really other main engager Nautilus in that same vein. I think I would typically take Leona after all of them, but, you know, I still think JJ had a lot of really good moments, and even though he is getting dud of the series, I don't necessarily think it was a negative. Perry was good. They very much prioritized the Poppy, but I think obviously the Kindred game is the one that's going to stand out for a lot of people because he was able to get a lot of gold early. I think in general, Fear executed on their game plan rather well. DSG was just a little bit better, and that's okay. Like, you're not going to freak out over that, you know what I mean? DSG is a really good team, probably the best in the NACL at the current moment, and so to have it come down to a Game 5 where you really were playing relatively well and then just couldn't quite get it done in the end, I certainly think there are worse ways to go into the lower bracket, and honestly, this was a big confidence booster. I'm not going to spoil what happens in the rest of the week, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how Fear ends up adapting. But for DSG, congratulations. They're going to be moving into Grand Finals now, the NACL Finals. We will not be talking about them for the rest of this episode. Instead, we're going to be finding out who their opponent is going to be, but if they continue to play at the level that they're currently playing, with the form that they currently have, it might not even really matter who they have to go up against. And now we move on back into the lower bracket. That was a nice detour into our final upper bracket series of the playoffs here, technically, because we're not counting grand finals as an upper bracket, I guess, if you will. But we get to move back down to the lower bracket, and it's two teams that we have already discussed in this video. Two of the teams that have won a series going up against each other for the right to play in the semifinals and to potentially play their way into the NACL finals against DSG. It's a matchup between the number 2 seeded FlyQuest challengers and the number 7 seeded Evil Geniuses challengers, and EG's miracle run is not going to stop here. They end up taking down Fly. Evil Geniuses has now eliminated the 2 top seeds in the NACL at the current moment. An unbelievable run from Evil Geniuses. They get their revenge from round number 1 here against FlyQuest, and they're able to take them down 3-1. It wasn't even a 5-game set. They won 3 of the 4 games that they ended up playing against them. And yes, Game 3 was relatively dominant from FlyQuest, but still a lot of positives to take away from, you know, Evil Geniuses across this entire series. This team has really just come together at the exact right time. Everybody's really clicking in a way that I just don't think they have over the course of the regular season, basically at any point, including spring. Even when this team was beating some of the top tier teams and being able to hold their own in matchups like that, they weren't quite looking like this, which is just, quite frankly, utterly dominant. Everything is coming together for Evil Geniuses. Now, I do want to address something again. I know that there are a lot of comments just in general about Evil Geniuses and that how them existing in this current state is somehow bad for the NACL or isn't what the NACL should be used for, and I do want to kind of push back on that. I pushed back on that idea in the past, but I'm going to do it again here. There was actually a fantastic Reddit post. I don't usually post things in the description, but I'm going to leave a link to that post in the description, or at least it was a Reddit comment on the post-game thread for this series that kind of brought it up. But the reason that Evil Geniuses is doing good is because, yes, like, you want to see young players develop, but you want to see young players develop into people that can be able to beat Ryoma and King and Armeo and Smoothie and these veterans, right? I don't think it should be against them as players because they're veterans, right? I don't think that them having played in the LCS should prohibit them from being good enough to play in the NACL. I think that that is an absurd comment to make. Not only are these guys professionals and it is kind of their life to play League of Legends, they need to make enough money and there's only 50 spots in the LCS. I mean, players like Ryoma and King are in a foreign country and, you know, trying to make a living doing this, and these are opportunities that they just normally wouldn't have in a lot of other circumstances. But, I mean, if you filled the league with 50, you know, complete rookies that had never really played in the LCS and hadn't really had a lot of time to grow against veterans, then, like, how are we ever supposed to see if they're getting better? And how are we ever supposed to test as to whether or not these guys are growing and are ready, right? I think having a team like Evil Geniuses in the league is positive for the league overall. It gives players like Spyrax and Masu and Faisal and Yuji, these young, up-and-coming, stars in the North American scene, opponents that they can test themselves with that we know are generally really strong. And unfortunately, they weren't able to come out on top. And it just goes to show these players are still really good at what they do. And so, again, I highly suggest you take a look at it's kind of a short little Reddit comment down in the description below, but this was a really interesting series, even outside of that. My player of the series is going to go to Armeo in the jungle. It really does feel like he's, reinvigorated a lot of what this team wants to do in terms of macro in the early game. They play so much faster than they did before, and I think that's a positive. Now, obviously, Ryoma in particular had always been a rather aggressive mid laner, and even with Shaden on the roster, they were never slow in terms of how they played, but Armeo definitely knows what he wants to do on the map in any given matchup. Whether that's on, the Nocturne, the Lilia, or the Ivern, I think all three of those champions really worked to his benefit, and especially those first two games, that Nocturne and that Lilia were just so devastating to have to play into. I really like the Lilia in game 2 in particular, just really, really fun, but Armeo, in my opinion, is a big reason why this team is performing at such a high level. I know people have a generally low opinion of him at the current moment, but I think that it's honestly kind of, I don't want to say built out of nothing, but unfair to Armeo. He was really good for 4 weeks of action and was bad in week 5, and then he got replaced for it. They really just were looking for a reason to promote Shaden, and that was their reason. But Armeo, in my opinion, is still an LCS caliber jungler. I think he proved that a lot over the course of the beginning of the LCS split, and so to see him dominate the NACL and just be as good as he has been for this Evil Geniuses team, it's not particularly surprising, but everybody else was still great. I think Smoothies very quietly had a phenomenal playoff run here. He was great in this series on the Rakan, was a massive positive for the team overall. Honestly, very much considered giving him player of the series. Was just really fun to watch. Ryoma and King definitely stepped up as the two main carries for this team. Ryoma in particular has been so good for this team over the course of 2023. Again, he's had bad performances, he's had bad games, but that's always going to be Ryoma. He's a relatively inconsistent player, but man, when he's clicking, he's still a top, 2 at worst mid laner in the NACL, right? He really is that good at his best. He might not be that every game, but when you get games like this, a series like this, going into Spyrax, and Ryoma's just, way better in terms of being able to generate pressure in the early game and moving around the map with it, it's impressive stuff. And then Surdy continues to be a positive. I just really like this Evil Geniuses team. I think everybody is playing well right now. They're all playing like some of the top players in their roles, and they got to top 3 off of the merit of that and not off of any sort of easy schedule, because they took down FlyQuest and Team Liquid. Certainly not an easy schedule. They've earned their place here in top 3. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, it's unfortunate again that your season ends this way. It's a very similar argument to what I made for Team Liquid earlier on in the video, where I assume you probably wanted to go a little bit further than 4th place, but I do think that there are some positives to take away from this split. Even though he wasn't great in this series, this was Yuji's best split as a professional, in my opinion. He was really good over the course of 2023, summer in particular, a major improvement over spring, and I really do think that he emerged as one of the most interesting jungle prospects. That being said, he was my dud of the series here. He was very much out-jungled by Armeo in terms of the pressure that he was able to output on the map. A lot of crazy picks, pulling out the Diana, pulling out the Graves that he did so well on earlier in the weekend against Wildcard. It just didn't necessarily work out against a jungler that might be a little bit more controlled in his style than what Keel is. Someone who's a little bit more aggressive and will give over a lot of those 50-50s to the Graves, but there were still some positives on this team. I do think that, Masu, while he was a little bit over-aggressive at times in this series, also had some really fantastic moments, and mechanically speaking, it's Masu. We know what you were going to get with him. He's super freaking good. Winsome, I think, had some problems, but I still think he was generally fine across the series. Spyrax was certainly out-pressured by Ryoma, but he wasn't the major negative for this team. Faisal, I think, was, again, generally fine in the top lane. FlyQuest really didn't get absolutely bodied or anything in this series. They just kind of got out-tempoed by a team that really does look like they're maybe the best in the NACL at the current moment, and I'm not going to blame them too much for that. Again, I like this FlyQuest team. I really like the growth that a lot of these players went on. And if we're seeing all 5 of these players in the LCS, maybe not just next year, but over the next couple of years, I'm certainly not going to be surprised. All of them have major LCS upside. We've already seen Spyrax. Yuji and Masu are certainly not going to be far to follow. Masu in particular. I would be shocked if he doesn't have an LCS team at the start of next year. That's how good Masu is. And I would hope to see him continue to play with Winsome. I think that bot lane duo has really worked for FlyQuest. But Faisal and Yuji as well, Maybe they don't have rosters at the beginning of 2024, but it's not going to be long before these guys end up making it so obvious that they have to be in the LCS that they just break through eventually. And for FlyQuest, I think you're going to take that as a positive, especially with all the uncertainty on your LCS roster at the current moment. Having a group of 5 players that, yes, wasn't able to get the job entirely done in the playoffs, but has so much upside and has proven so much of it mechanically, I think is generally going to be considered a positive for 2023. But for Evil Geniuses, they continue their miracle run here. The 7 seed has now made the top 3. We're going to cover the semifinals in just a second, but they are 1 series away from making the NACL finals as a team that, quite frankly, barely scraped into the playoffs in general, was in danger of being able to miss out on them at all in the final week of the season. And so really good stuff from EG, and they have turned it on at the exact right time. And then moving on to our final series of the video here, our semi-finals matchup. And this is going to determine who is going to be facing off against DSG in the NACL finals. I'm really excited to go over it. And it's 2 teams that absolutely deserve to be here. They have played their ways here, and they both have gotten here off the merit of their success and of their ability to beat good teams up until this point. But who's going to be good enough to be able to come out on top? Well, it was a matchup between Cincinnati Fear and Evil Geniuses Challengers, and the winner was EGC, and they took it in 4 games, and you've just got to feel relatively excited for this roster and for this team. They were struggling so much over the course of this year, and for all of that to lead up into them being one of the top 2 teams in the NACL, it's an incredibly exciting time. Now, obviously, if you're Fear on the other side, it's the opposite. This has to feel miserable, heartbreaking, you know, whatever word you want to use for it. It can't feel particularly good. You felt like you were in such a good spot, 1 series away from going to the NACL finals, but I think there are so many positives to take away from this year, not only for the org, but for the players and just for everything even in this series. Like, there are just a lot of good things, I think, in general to say about Fear. We will absolutely get to them, but let's talk about Evil Geniuses first and foremost. These players are so talented. It really is just the case. I think their superstars have really been able to step up, and honestly, their pool of really good players has grown exponentially over the last few weeks. It's basically all 5 of them at this point that are playing at a really high level. Player of the series, no brainer, basically has to go to King in this one. He went 44-7-28 through 4 games. Yeah, that's pretty player of the series worthy. Absurd. 11 kills per game in a best of 4 in the semifinals. That's absurd. Obviously a great series from him, but one thing I just want to talk about when it comes to King, there's this conversation and I guess this like perception of him that he's this 4A player, someone who has always been too good for the NACL, but has somehow proven that he's not good enough for the LCS, and this is something that I just don't particularly understand. I would get it if he had gotten like an extended run as a starter in the LCS at any point in his career, but he's never gotten that. His only LCS games in his career, and I know a lot of people don't know this, his only LCS games in his entire career were filling in for Cloud9, first of all when Sven wasn't able to make it, and then later when Berserker wasn't able to make it. He's literally only been a temporary substitute for the best AD carries in the league on the best teams in the league. He's literally never had an LCS spot. That is so unfortunate for a player of King's caliber who's been as good for as long as King has been good. He's been arguably the best AD carry in, you know, Academy or the NACL for what, 3 or 4 years now, and to never be given a shot? It's absurd. I don't know what upside he has to show that he hasn't already shown. He has been phenomenal at this level, and for him to have never been given an opportunity, it's just like, it's not real. Like, I don't understand. I don't get it even really at all. King has been fantastic, and now people are going to act like it's too late. Like, oh, you know, because he's been in Academy for so long, clearly, you know, it's too late. There are too many good young prospects like Masu and like Manui on the other side that are going to be LCS candidates first. And it's just like, man, this entire system feels like it's failed King as it has failed so many players before him. But the rest of this team was also really good. Smoothie had 71 assists through 4 games. That's pretty darn good. And the Rakan definitely showed up on film. He's been so good on Rakan all weekend long. Really has been the a highlight pick for Evil Geniuses, and he showed why in this series. Ryoma was really good. I thought he was really consistent on all the mages that he was playing. Shochi certainly showed up and tried to play a lot of the comfort picks that he's kind of known for. We'll get into that in a little bit, but Ryoma was ready for it, and he was able to answer well. And Surdy, man, Surdy's so crazy good. It's almost unfair how good Surdy is considering he was a last-minute addition to this team. How was he teamless for most of the NACL split? How did we allow that to happen? Surdy is so crazy good, and again, he showed it off in the series. Armeo was fantastic as more of a facilitator in this role, and in general, Evil Geniuses just feel so complete as a unit. I know I feel like I'm repeating myself so much over the course of this video. I've said it a bunch of times in these series already. It's the third series we've covered from EG, but really, all they have proven over the course of these 3 series is that you simply have to take them seriously. King is an elite player, and he was in the regular season as well, arguably the best regular season AD carry in the NACL purely on a performance level. I still love you, Masu. Ryoma was fantastic all year long, and he's not going to get the credit he deserves. Armeo has certainly improved the quality of this team, but they were good before he got in. People forget that Surdy's addition to this team in the top lane is really what started to change their fortunes. As soon as he came in and started becoming one of the better top laners in the league, Evil Geniuses started winning even with Shaden. And so, Smoothie's been great. Everybody's winning on Evil Geniuses. Everybody's doing well, and they deserve this. They deserve to be going to the finals with how they've played, but for Fear on the other side, the only thing I can say is keep your head held high. This was a phenomenal year for Cincinnati Fear. Let's not lose sight of where the expectations and the ideas for this team were in the preseason. A lot of people were saying that they were the worst team in the NACL. I myself had them number 15, I believe, out of 16 in my preseason power rankings in January, and they've now finished in 4th in the spring split and in 3rd in the summer split. When it got harder, summer so much harder, the talent pool was drastically shallowed, I guess, if you will. Only the good teams survived, and so with 10 teams, obviously every team was going to be more competitive, and Fear somehow got better over the course of that stretch. Pretty much every individual player on this team proved why they deserve to be a top candidate for LCS teams moving into next year. Perry and Shochi have been very vocal about over the course of this year, but it's not just them. Manui's growth over the course of this year has been astounding and incredibly positive. I think his pairing with JJ has gotten better over the course of the year, and JJ, I think, has definitely shown his positives, and I think Philip has absolutely shown a lot of the good things that we all kind of saw in him, back on the FlyQuest days, even not just last split, but in the LCS, right? Everybody on Fear made it work. Now, this series was a little bit more difficult because, honestly, this was probably the series they played the worst over the course of the playoffs, in my opinion, in terms of the grand scheme of things. There were some positives to take away, but I think in general, Evil Geniuses was kind of the better team today, and again, with how I've talked about EG, that's okay. Like, that's an acceptable thing to be able to say. If you would have told me that Fear at the beginning of the year would lose in the semifinals to Evil Geniuses and get 3rd place, I would have said that that was a ridiculous overachievement for this team, and so really good stuff coming in from them. Philip is going to get my dud of the series again. I think Surdy's just crazy good, and I thought he was crazy good in this series, and Philip was unfortunately the one that I think kind of had to deal with that a lot of this series, but I don't think Philip was particularly awful. I think Perry had moments where he wasn't so good. Manui and JJ certainly had moments where they weren't so good. Shochi had a couple of really bad moments where he wasn't so good. It's okay. It happens. You're not going to be perfect 100% of the time, especially when, things are going wrong around the map, just in general. I like that this team stuck to their guns and stayed true to their playstyle that kind of got them here. Shochi playing Zed and Tryndamere, and a lot of these things that he's gotten super well known for over the course of this year. Obviously, things like Akshan fall into that, but the Lucian being pulled out in game number 4 was really good. Manui pulling out that Vygar in game number 4. He showed in this series that he can play really good AD carries. He can play Xayah at a high level like he did in game 2, but he's still going to be able to pull out those Vygars like he did across basically all year long. JJ's really good on engagers, and I think as soon as the meta kind of shifted back into that focus, Fear got better. Perry, as more of a facilitator playing a lot of tanks in this series, didn't necessarily get to shine like he had in some previous series, but he's really good at facilitators as well as carries. And Philip, I think, obviously was in a tough competition here going up against Surdy, but more than held his own, and obviously he's coming off of a great series where he went toe-to-toe with Fake God, and so everybody on Fear has been stepping up. There is nobody here who does not deserve at least a look, and if all 5 of these players at the very least are not in the NACL next year, I'm gonna lose my goddamn mind. I don't have an answer to that. They've been too good and too consistent. I know a lot of people are gonna sit here and say, Fear bottled it, right? They were up 2-0 in winners finals and, they couldn't get it done or whatever, whatever bullshit they're going to say. But at the end of the day, this is a phenomenal split for Fear, and truly to me, it's only positive takeaways for a lot of these players. And then, like I said, for EG, congratulations on moving on to the finals. You were fantastic all series long, and I'm really, really excited to see if they're going to be able to finish the story and get the job done and become champions. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL end of round 2, all of round 3, most of round 4 overview and analysis video. I know I covered a lot in today's video, 5 full series, 3 of them being best of 5s, but I still hope you guys enjoyed it, even if it was a little bit more condensed. We've only got the finals left. DSG taking on Evil Genius's challengers. I'm incredibly excited for that matchup. Kind of previewing it in my head, this is a very intriguing battle between two teams. I think top lane's going to be a major deal in this series. Fake God has been kind of the driving force for DSG through a lot of their year, especially in their team fighting stage, in my opinion. And Surdy, I think, has been fantastic. Going to be really interesting to see if either side can generate massive advantages. But Tomio into Armeo is going to be fantastic. Young, a very, very, I don't want to say unproven, but more rookie-oriented mid laner taking on the veteran in the mid lane in Ryoma. And similar things in the bot lane with Meech taking on King. And then you've got two stalwart supports, former Cloud9 supports, Smoothie and Zazel going head-to-head. A lot of really interesting storylines going on in the finals. I'm really interested to hear what you guys think down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to be able to take it? Who is going to be the 2023 NACL Summer Split Champions? Would love to know you guys' thoughts. I don't even really know myself. This is going to be a super fun series to watch, and I really do hope it goes all 5 and is very competitive. I'd love to see both teams really step up because I think they both have it in them, but that's going to be it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comment section below. And of course, leave a like. It really does mean a lot for me and the channel. Not only does it let me know that you guys are enjoying it, but helps get this video out to a lot more people, which of course is very appreciated. And then, of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. I don't only post about the NACL on this channel, I post about all 4 of the major regions as well. And playoffs are kicking off everywhere around the world. The LCK is only 1 week away, and that's how you know playoffs are really rocking and rolling. Worlds is just around the corner, and if you want in-depth analysis on all of the teams that are going to be in contention for qualifying for that tournament, this is the channel, and this is the place for it. Go ahead and hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.